In our modern times when we're thinking about bottom line and managing farm margins to make a profit, if you can get producers to think about the cover crops as an investment, it gets a little easier to think about adopting them.
In this episode of Voices from the Field, NCAT Sustainable Agriculture Specialist Mike Lewis joins Shawn Lucas, an assistant professor of organic agriculture at Kentucky State University, in a conversation about cover crops. In addition to specific crops, Mike and Shawn talk about the timing of planting cover crops and the benefits that they can bring to a farmer's bottom line. Shawn also describes his ongoing small ruminant research. Let's listen.
Hello everybody, this is Mike Lewis from the National Center for Appropriate Technologies based out of southeastern Kentucky. My guest today is Dr. Shawn Lucas from Kentucky State University, and we are going to be talking about cover crops. But first, Dr. Lucas, if you'd be so kind as to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Shawn Lucas. I am assistant professor of organic agriculture at Kentucky State University. I'm also a certified crop advisor, and I represent Kentucky State on the advisory board for the Southern Cover Crops Council. So I'm glad to be here today to talk about cover crops.
That's great. I've had the pleasure of knowing you and gleaning knowledge from you for a long time, so it's great to be able to share it with a little bit of a wider audience. When we first met, we were in a class talking about soil health. You actually were a professor of mine way back when, not so long ago. And it was a soil health class, and so I know, of course, that cover crops play a really big role in our production system, but I would love it if you could just give us a broad overview of what cover crops do in terms of soil health in organic production systems.
Well, cover crops are a multifaceted crop that is pretty easy to incorporate into a production system with a little bit of planning. And obviously they're called cover crops because we're growing them to protect the soil surface from wind and water erosion. But we derive a lot of soil health benefits from cover crops as well, mainly because if you manage them right, cover crops can be a great way to build soil organic matter, which is really the key component of soil health.
And in my experience can have a significant impact on pest control and disease control as well. If you could just touch on that aspect of how cover crops impact insect and disease control.
Well, when I think of what cover crops can control, I'm more thinking in terms of maybe weed suppression as opposed to disease and insect control. Obviously, cover crops can serve as a repository for beneficial insects. If you're growing the right summer cover crop, something that will attract, pollinators, beneficial wasps, parasitic wasps that might attack some of your problem insects that affect your crops. But really, what I like cover crops for in terms of helping to control problems is for their ability to suppress weeds. And they have several different mechanisms by which cover crops can suppress weeds in a cropping system. They can be allelopathic, which means that they have some chemicals in the biomass of the cover crop that they either secrete or they can be released as the cover crop residues decompose. And those chemicals will inhibit either weed seed germination or weed growth when those weeds are exposed to those chemicals. Now, it's a short-term thing, and you do have to time it in management. Once the residues are gone, the cover crop residues are gone, those allelopathic chemicals will dissipate, and then the weeds can sort of get a foothold again. And you also have to be careful with what you grow after certain cover crops, because you don't want these allelopathic chemicals affecting your crops. But allelopathy is one mechanism. Another mechanism is cover crops, if you manage them right and plant them correctly, they can just have a very dense canopy, which serves to outcompete and smother weeds, compete for those nutrients and other resources that the weeds might be trying to get as well. So it depends on whether you're, deciding on whether should I leave a summer field fallow or should I grow a cover crop. If you're in Kentucky or areas east of the Mississippi where we have enough water, I'd say a cover crop is a good idea, and you can compete out some of those problem weeds. Cover crop residues can also inhibit germination of weed seeds in early spring, just because some seeds require light to germinate, and that cover crop mulch on the surface will prevent that light from hitting the weed seeds and stimulating germination. So there are a couple of different mechanisms for weed control, but strategically managed cover crops can be a good tool in the toolbox, particularly for an organic farmer where you don't have some of the chemical tools in the toolbox that a non-organic producer would have.
Yeah, it certainly seems like if more people would adopt this, as you were just explaining, as a weed suppression method, that would have a significant impact on just the herbicide load that's making its way back into the watershed now. So one of the interesting things you talked about that I heard you say is you talked about this system and timing. So I would like to dive into that a little bit and maybe give just a for instance, just to sort of understand how you would plan a cover crop rotation. So let's say I've just harvested 100-foot row of spinach. How long do I wait before turning that soil back over or if I'm not turning it over, if I'm no-tilling it, how long do I ideally want to leave that fallow? I mean, this systems thinking is, I think, part of the struggle that we all have as farmers is what's the timing and what's the proper mechanism. So how long would you wait from the time you took a crop out? And then if I only had a 30-day slot, if I was going from spinach to 30 days fallow and then to carrots, is it worth me putting a cover crop in that 30-day slot? I guess so. I just asked you two questions, and now you have to unpack them.
Well, that is the trick, and timing is going to depend on several things, like you articulated, the crop that you're growing, what your ultimate plans are for the entire year for a particular area or field, whatever you're growing in, high tunnel, whatever it may be. You have to figure out how the cover crop is going to fit within your system. And so if you had a 30-day window, in the example you just gave me, you want to pick something that grows really quick, puts on a lot of biomass really fast. Coming out of spinach, assuming, are we talking late spring?
Yeah, late spring.
After the last frost?
Yes.
Yeah, so you might put something like buckwheat in that would get you a pretty significant amount of biomass within a couple of weeks. Now, earlier in the spring, it's a challenge because the temperature isn't going to be conducive to as fast of growth for something like buckwheat as you would get in the spring, or in the summer, rather. Something that would put on a lot of biomass rather quickly, that you can turn over rather easily, and then jump into your next crop in your cropping cycle. But really, it's going to vary for all the different operations out there and the different rotation systems that producers are going to have. You really got to find what's going to fit within your rotation.
My answer to that question would be I do plant buckwheat whenever I only have a 30-day window, just because it seems really well adapted here and it gives me a quick bunch of biomass to put back in the soil before whatever that crop is that's coming in next. What I hear is this goes, I just met with a couple cattle ranchers, and they were talking to me. They told me this interesting story, which I'll butcher, so I'm not even going to try to tell it, but how at first they were farming cows, and then they shifted their focus and thought, no, we're really farming grass. But now their focus has shifted entirely, and they're really farming the soil. So in essence, using cover crops in your rotation is really about long-term whole farm planning, because at the end of the day, your end goal is to help maintain the fertility and the resiliency of that soil that you're putting your crops in. So it speaks really well to that whole farm planning concept and having long-term plans. Are there tools or strategies that you found to help producers sort of make those decisions? Is there like a magic website you can go to, like Google, and it will tell you all of that? No. But, how do you help farmers determine what that rotation is and how what the proper crop is for the proper timing?
For me, working in organic agriculture primarily, one of my biggest considerations is managing soil organic matter. And you can get into thinking about what is the value of building soil organic matter in a system. How much benefit do you gain from natural nutrient cycling processes associated with having a greater level of organic matter? And there are people who have tried to put a number on this, like every percentage of organic matter is worth about $600 an acre. That's kind of a highball number that some colleagues and friends of mine in extension at Ohio State came up with a couple of years back. It said every percentage point of organic matter was worth about $600 an acre because of savings in inputs. And so instead of thinking about cover crops like a cost, because you're planting it and the seeds cost money and you're tilling it in or just mulching it, so you're not really taking anything off the soil that's going to make you money in return immediately, you have to think of it like an investment where you're kind of putting money in the bank to let it grow. And what you're growing is your soil organic matter and your soil health to really facilitate all those natural processes that are going to save you money on inputs in the long run. You know, in our modern times when we're thinking about bottom line and managing farm margins to make a profit, if you can get producers to think about the cover crops as an investment, it gets a little easier to think about adopting them.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of information out now that makes it, easier for farmers to see the value in it. And when I started farming, I wasn't thinking about soil health. That's the way I'd been taught. You don't leave the dirt bare, and it's so much more complex than that. I do want to talk about a couple specific cover crops that you use and employ and why you use them and in what context. But I do want to give you an opportunity to talk real quick, if you'd like, about I know that you've done some research with small ruminants in organic crop production systems, and I would like to give you an opportunity to talk about that, because that's something that of course, I have a lot of excitement around, as you well know.
Sure. Well, at Kentucky State University, we have what is called our Evans-Allen project. It's a NEFA funded project, USDA NEFA, and we are looking at small ruminants on pasture for 3 out of 5 years in a 5-year organic rotation, where the other 2 years are organic corn and organic soybean. So we've got 3 years of animals on pasture, followed by a year of corn, a year of soybean. Obviously, in organic, we're doing a fair bit of tillage and cultivation for managing weeds. And then, right after the corn, soybean, bang, we put it right back into the ruminants on pasture. And, we're experimenting with small ruminants, because there's not a lot of work that's been done. We're working with goats specifically. A lot of the work that has been done in integrated crop livestock systems has been on cattle. We work with a lot of small scale, under-resourced, underrepresented producers in Kentucky. And so, goats and smaller operations are options for them. And so we're trying to develop an information base that may help people make decisions on, whether or not integrating goats into a cropping system, whether it be horticultural, we're using grains, but there might be ways you could adapt it for other systems, is something they might want us to consider. And so we're looking at nutrient loading in the groundwater underneath these research plots, and we're also looking at soil health benefits, including soil aggregate stability, labile or active soil carbon, and then total carbon. So we're kind of looking at the overall ebb and flow of organic matter. When you're cropping and tilling, you're going to reduce that organic matter, and when you have an undisturbed pasture with animals defecating and urinating on it, you're going to build that organic matter resource back up. So far, we've seen that the goats aren't really contributing to a lot of problems with nutrients in the groundwater, and the overall organic matter levels are at least staying stable over the course of, we're 4 years into the 5-year rotation. And so it seems like the balancing act is working, and we're looking forward to hopefully in the next year or so getting some of that data published.
That's great. Well, I look forward to reading that. Kentucky, this is off topic, surprise. But you mentioned the small farms in Kentucky, and I think that it's so great to have you guys there doing that research on goats and small ruminants, because so many of the farms in Kentucky, the Kentucky farms aren't small and diversified because some by choice, but it's geographical, so it's really great that you guys are able to do the type of research at Kentucky State that you are around small ruminants, because it's critical to Kentucky's farm infrastructure,
Yep.
I believe. Caveat, I don't raise any small ruminants.
Well, we're fortunate at Kentucky State to have Dr. Ken Andrews, and he is our small ruminant specialist, and he's worked pretty closely with me on the animal management side of that. I come from a crop and soils background, and so I'd spend most of my day with my staff chasing goats if it wasn't for Dr. Andrews' staff and his input. So we're lucky to have him there as a resource. So it kind of just fit naturally with the needs of what Kentucky producers might be. We have an established goat research program there. It seemed like it fit. So we're trying to answer some questions.
No, that's great. So I do want to move on, because I know that I can make you get long-winded, or vice versa. But I do want to just for the sake of educating people, I do want to pick out a couple specific cover crops that you use, and maybe just talk
Sure.
for a minute about why you use them and how you use them. Of course, I wanted to talk about buckwheat. You already circumvented that by saying it grows quick. So,
Oh, we could pick up on that for a minute. I love buckwheat in the summer. It is a great crop to squeeze into a narrow window. It puts on biomass really fast. It produces flowers very quickly.
They're so beautiful.
And
They
they're
really are.
aesthetically pleasing, and in an organic system, they do attract some biodiversity, some beneficial insects. We tend to see a few more ladybugs around when we have buckwheat near our crops, and there's anecdotal evidence that they may bring in some of the other parasitic insects that prey upon some of the insects that we don't want there. But buckwheat just grows so fast, rapid biomass onset, and when you terminate it, you immediately have a nice slug of organic matter going back into your soil. The only trick is don't let it go to seed.
I've got some wild native buckwheat down by the creek that I've been been selectively breeding for some time now. Yeah, well, we do try to get some of it to go to seed here, just because we're using it in small plot rotations. So 200 pounds of seed goes a long way for us. So we do try to harvest some of it, but
Sure.
we're not super efficient at it, so we end up buying a lot. Yeah, and I know, like, my favorite thing is, we could have this whole acre in produce out here, vegetables, and you could get 15 feet from the buckwheat row and hear the pollination
Yep.
taking on. I mean, the
Yeah.
pollinators love it. So, but we won't beat it to death.
Well, and it'll flower at times when other things aren't out there, and that's why it seems to draw a lot of pollinators, which obviously if it attracts pollinators to an area near your crops, it's going to be good for your crops as well.
Yeah, it seems to throw. I mean, it loves flowering in August. And most everything else is like, give me water.
Yeah,
And,
yeah.
and it seems to stay really healthy. And I just, we use it's our go-to if we have a week.
Yeah.
We'll put it in. So beyond buckwheat, what are some other common? I guess I've put us into the vegetable pigeonhole, vegetable production, organic vegetable production with my buckwheat out here. But what are some other common cover crops that you?
Well, depending on what your window is, if you have a little bit of a longer window in the summer, and it's interesting to start with our conversation centering on summer cover crops, because I think most people think of cover crops as a fall, winter kind of thing, but there are a lot of good options for summer. So if you have a little bit of a longer window and you're trying to take a field out of commercial production and maybe do some soil building, I like sun hemp, which is a legume, and it will put on some biomass very quickly, but also get you a little bit of nitrogen back in your system. I also like Sorghum Sudan, also known as Sudex, which is a grass related to sorghum, obviously. Grows very quick, grows very dense. You can get a whole lot of biomass the longer you let it go, the more biomass you're going to get. And that one does have some nice allelopathic properties where it will inhibit some of the weeds that you might find in your system. Those are the three I really like to play with in the summer. There's some interesting options out there. People are looking at teff as a summer cover crop. Clovers do fairly well. So you have lots of options, but those are the ones that I kind of lean on. Teff is more of an experimental, so unless you've done a little homework on it, I'd be careful using that until you do some homework on it. But it's a warm season, fast growing grass, native to Ethiopia and other areas around there and in Africa. It's actually a food source, human food source there, but the seeds are very small and difficult to harvest. So people here have really taken to using it as a ground cover. Something that I want to play with and research going forward here in the next couple of years. We're lucky that Steve Diver at University of Kentucky has a wealth of knowledge on that, and so I need to tap his brain at some point and learn more about teff and get some out in the field and play with it.
Yeah, that'd be fun. I want to talk a little bit too now because I'm thinking about your, we just did summer, and so I'm moving into fall, and I'm also starting to think a little bit about not just talking about cover crops, but talking about crimp rolling.
Crimp rolling, yeah.
So I do want to hear about fall cover crops, but I'd also like to talk a little bit about crimp rolling too, if that's because I know that's some work that you've done.
Yeah.
You got a new crimp roller for your.
I actually haven't done as much work with crimp rolling as I'd like to do. I know just enough to be dangerous, and I've watched some people use it. And we're just really starting to dial in our crimp rolling system at Kentucky State. We got our crimper roller right before the pandemic, and it sat for a year, and I think this past spring was the first year we actually had it out and running. But the idea with a crimper roller is instead of mowing down your cover crop and mulching it, or in a non-organic system, you would terminate with herbicides and let that mulch lay in the soil surface. With a crimper roller, you can roll over that material, and you've got essentially a very heavy drum with some blades on it. They're not really sharp blades, but since it's so heavy, there's enough pressure on the stalks that it will crimp the stalks. And so when you roll it down, they can't stand back up. If you just had a flat roller and you rolled those crops down, they would bounce back up, and that would defeat the purpose of trying to terminate your cover crop. So if you crimp them and roll them, they lay down and stay down. It's a pretty efficient way to kill off a cover crop. In non-organic systems, people are using it and then planting right into the residue after crimper rolling, and they'll supplementally spray it with herbicide sometimes. In an organic system, you really have got to dial in your system because no-till's a little bit harder.
It takes time to get
in an organic system. I mean, it's very region specific, but the crimper roller is a nice way to lay down a cover crop, kill it, and get a good mulch on your soil surface to allow that cover crop to decompose and turn into organic matter and eventually create a nice planting bed later on in the season.
Very cool. I did hemp last fall.
As a cover crop?
And I crimp rolled it and I planted cabbage into it.
Nice.
The hemp did not kill with the crimp rolling. It just rooted off the stalks and kept going up. But I thought, oh, this will work. I should have waited until after the first couple frosts and let it die, and then rolled it down and planted into it. But I was in a rush to get the cabbage in. So if we're thinking about the fall, one of my favorite things for my kids to plant, and I know not a lot about what it does other than building organic matter in my soil, but my kids love planting the daikon radishes and coming back after we're prepping a bed after they've been in there and seeing the activity in the soil around the radishes. So in the fall, we actually haven't this year because we were late with a lot of things just for stuff going on, But we always plant a bunch of daikon radishes in the fall. So is that
what kind of activity are you seeing?
Oh, there's just a lot of worms and you can see the creatures, and the worms seem to like hollow in and make houses out of them after it warms up.
Sure. And they do a good job at breaking up the soil, and so I think it makes sense that worms would be in there if you're loosening up the soil, making it easier for the worms to move around. But that's essentially, one of the cool things about daikons. People use them to loosen up compacted soils, especially some of the deeper rooting daikons. You can get different varieties with different varying depths of root penetration, but some of those daikons are specifically called tillage radishes. I hope I'm not infringing on anybody's copyright there, but you know, the whole point is that they send their root down and penetrate some of those areas where you might have a plow pan or more compacted soil, and they loosen it all up, and then whatever you're growing after them, you know, has a nice pore. Since you're killing them, it's got a nice pore in the soil with organic matter filling it up, and, you know, greater water retention and greater water infiltration. So all the good things, aeration, all the good things that you want to happen or that you hope to get out of a cover crop, those tillage radishes can have a fairly quick impact.
And some of them can take some pretty cold weather, I've noticed.
Yep, and if you get a lot of them that don't take cold weather, they smell really interesting when,
Yeah,
when they die off after frost.
Yeah, we switched varieties twice. No, and that's cool because that's like literally, I always feel, well, I tell the kids at least, and in my, you know, non-scientific way, I tell the kids, like, that's like just a big bunch of food that we grew for the soil.
Yep.
You know.
Feed the soil to feed the crop.
Yeah. So, what else in the winter though? I mean, do you use peas or what types of things do you?
I mean, you know, I'm most familiar with a mixture of rye and vetch, and we grow that an awful lot at the university. I actually want to diversify that, where I maybe mix 2 or 3 plants in. Well, I guess rye and vetch is 2, but maybe I start adding things like a tillage radish or some other type of plant in there. Yeah, rye is good for biomass. It comes on pretty strong. It'll grow fairly constantly all through the winter, even in the coldest parts of winter. It will, you know, survive pretty deep freezes and continue to grow. And then in the spring, it'll really crank out the biomass and get you some good plant material to donate to your organic matter. And then you mix vetch in with that, and I like about a 60-40 ratio of rye to vetch, but anywhere in between 60-40 rye vetch to 40-60 rye vetch. People play with that ratio to suit their needs, but the vetch gets you nitrogen and a fair bit of biomass as well. And so it's a legume. That's a nice combination for both building nitrogen and for building organic matter. You know, there are other options in there. Winter pea is something a lot of growers use. Wheat and clover are both nice. Wheat obviously is another small grain, very tolerant of colder temperatures. Clover is nice because you can frost seed that late in the season, and it will still generally kick out some biomass once you get into the spring. So really it's all about, you know, blending things that are going to get you some biomass and maybe get you some nitrogen input. That's what I'm always seem to be thinking about when I'm thinking about winter cover crops.
You know, it occurs to me, if you allow the rye to grow to maturity and turn it into another product, it could actually keep you warm in the dead of winter as well.
Kentucky's famous for some of those products. They're Kentucky agricultural products.
Let me get that right. So I don't want to skip, well, I do want to skip winter, because we just listed all the fall crops that you're going to leave in over the winter. There's not much you plant for crops in the winter. If we're being conscious of the 3 seasons now, as we've scientifically proven there are only 3.
We're trying to narrow it down more, I think, going forward.
We're trying to make it easier. As we move into spring, right, that's the time when we're planting a lot of crops, right? But I don't know if this is normal, but I look at, there's 2 springs, you know, in Kentucky. There's my first round and my second round. So what are good strategies or good crops, you know, for that springtime? Are you
there's like brassica spring, and then there's like the spring that comes after brassica spring, right? All your cold crops. But before we go there, I do want to emphasize, you know, cover crops that we're planting for fall. You know, we talked about timing earlier. You've really got to think about your timing there. You know, the later you get them in the fall, the less biomass you will generate in the spring. So I like to come in as early as I can. You know, at the university, corn is it's a full season crop, right? And so I try to find my shortest season varieties of certified organic corn that'll do well in Kentucky so that I can get it out and get my rye vetch in as early as I can so I can maximize the benefit I'm going to get from that cover crop over the winter and into early spring. You know, and then on the spring side of things, it's the same thing. You're going to have all kinds of variables coming your way, like anything in agriculture, right? Weather conditions and starting to rain here, right? You know, the rain will inhibit your ability to get into the field and terminate your cover crop and plant your subsequent crops, right? And so these are all things that we have to deal with, challenges that we face when we add this extra layer of cover crops into our cropping systems. But I think in the long term, adding the benefits of those cover crops is worth the extra thought process it takes to get those in there successfully. Now, what was the question about spring? We had brassica spring and subsequent spring, and
it's raining.
it's raining.
No, it was about brassica spring, but I mean that's important. You know, one of the things that I always, you know, hear from my coworkers at NCAT is we talk about this concept that diversity is part of a risk management strategy, and I think as you said earlier, thinking about cover crops as an investment, you know, that's one aspect, but it also adds a layer of insurance and protection for your farm too, for, you know, whatever the weather or the markets might bring.
Sure.
So anyways, back to brassica spring. Well, pea spring, right? Because
Yeah.
we plant peas in February, right?
Sure.
So, but no, spring cover crops. Are there any specific ones that do better in this region, or that you're more partial to, or?
Yeah. So brassicas in the spring. I like, you know, especially for some of the, you know, the markets that we cater to in organic, you know, things like kale, cabbage, you know, your salad mixes that include things like the mustard greens and the arugulas, you know, radishes are brassica as well. So your radishes, your breakfast radishes and Easter egg blend radish, you know, all those things. Those are all fun, and you know, obviously you got to cater to your market, but those are things that you can get in early in the spring, even earlier if you have, you know, access to season extension like a high tunnel. But yeah, those are all good options for generating some early season crops. Spinach, not a brassica, but it fits into that window, as do a lot of your, you know, your gourmet lettuce blends. And so, you know, a lot of the organic farms in this area will cater to, you know, some of your urban centers, and feed those organic greens into, you know, local outlets in the spring, and then, you know, by late spring the farmers market's opening up, and, you know, they plan well, so they still have some of that coming out, you know, later in the spring when the farmers markets open up.
That's one of the things I like about that season is, you know, down here if we're using the low tunnels that I'm pointing at, like you can see them, but if we use those low tunnels, those crops come out soon enough before we're starting to think about putting in cucumbers or tomatoes or whatever we're thinking about going in there. So we do have time for a quick cover crop, and I really like that. Again, just, you know, depending on how early it is, you know, we can or can't use buckwheat, but even getting a little bit more organic matter in there seems to really make us feel better, you know, having that extra 1 to 2 week window before when we would take those crops out and put.
Well, and you're right. I think maybe some of your peas might slide into that spot where you're not necessarily growing the pea to harvest the pod, but you're growing the pea to get a little bit of nitrogen and biomass in there.
Yeah, well, and fava beans
Fava
great
beans,
too.
yeah.
I'm so impressed with that plant, just in terms of its aesthetics. You know, I'm really impressed, but it does get very big and woody and has a lot of organic matter. And again, that I've found that's not something you want to let go to seed unless you're ready to harvest it, because it comes back pretty good.
Pretty quick, yeah.
Yeah. But, well, I think it's getting ready to rain, and it's going to be some tin bagging.
We're in Kentucky. Wait 10 minutes.
I know. The rain. What do you think about the rain? Like, look at my driveway. Look at the shed. You know, I mean, the water pressure has been so insane. And then I think about, you know, my colleagues out west who are dealing with drought and fires, and it's the complete opposite here. You know, and I think this is why it's a really timely, you know, to be talking about cover crops, because, you know, we have to figure out how to keep our soils healthy and resilient so that we can deal with these, you know, these little blips in weather that we're seeing now are going to become more the norm. I mean, I've been saying for 3 years, if it ever stops raining,
Yeah.
I can fix my drainage
Well,
ditch.
and you think about the long-term implications of climate change. One of the things that we've seen trending is more precipitation in the southeast. You mentioned the west is getting hotter and drier, but the southeast, particularly in the fall, is getting wetter for longer in the fall. And so, it's becoming ever more important to keep the soil covered, because you can erode a lot of good soil in the fall just like you can any other time of year. So
Real quick. And the humidity.
or driveways too.
Driveway, yeah, gravel, right. And, it's true though. I mean, the neighbor over here on, it's a creek side, he cut out his trees, and, I own the bottom quarter of that hillside that he cut, and he didn't cut that, but it's increased the water that comes down our holler and through here by threefold easily. So all these things in terms of like helping the soil to be able to hold moisture, to be, the sponge that it was when God made it, and said, this is good.
Sure.
Not, this is something you can play around with and try to make better, so. Well,
Something you've got to work with, not play around with.
Right?
Work with it.
What an idea. Work with it.
Work with it.
Manipulate it. I was just reading some
Figure
Wendell
out
last
how it
night,
works and work with it.
and I was reading 3 books at once. Not at once, but so I won't remember which book. But it was the quote that we're the only species that convinced ourselves we can create a technological solution for a biological problem. And I just think about that when we talk about cover crops. The concept of cover crops isn't new.
Yeah.
It just went away when we started trying to do it easier and more efficient or more cost effective, or whatever the reasoning was, that we made this huge shift to petrochemical agriculture. So cover crops, I think, are, they're part of the solution, right? They're not just a tool for us as farmers to help build healthy soils and to help keep our farm strong and resilient. They're also a tool for us to help mitigate some of the climate challenges that we face, because all of I guess I can say this, all of the climate challenges we face are caused by the way that we interact with our environment. And
Soils serve as a good, especially soils where maybe they've been beaten up over time. Getting soil organic matter back in those soils is it's not going to solve the problem, but it's a drop in the bucket, and every drop means something, right? And so if we can put more carbon back in our soils, and cover crops are a great tool for starting to do that. So I think you're hitting the nail right on the head with the way you're looking at it.
all right, well, we better wrap up.
Well, thanks for bringing me in. It's been fun. As always, I appreciate the opportunity, and I'll look forward to the next time, Mike.
No, I appreciate it, Dr. Shawn Lucas. Thank you so much for coming in, and we'll talk to you soon.
That's it for this episode. Thanks for listening. Additional information about this episode and related resources can be found at attra.ncat.org. Don't miss an episode. Subscribe to Voices from the Field wherever you get your podcasts. I'm your host, Rich Myers. ATTRA, Voices from the Field, is produced by the National Center for Appropriate Technology, headquartered in Butte, Montana. It's supported by the USDA Rural Business Cooperative Service as part of NCAT's ATTRA Sustainable Agriculture program. Any opinions, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this recording are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of the USDA or NCAT. We'll catch you again next week, and until then, keep on farming.